In this module, we shall discuss about dual gap analysis. There is inequality of saving and investment and thereby generates the gap in the economy. The two-gap model is an extension of the Harrod-Dommer growth model. The savings gap is found by introducing foreign trade and rephrasing the model such that savings gap, that is domestic savings, are inadequate to support the level of growth which could be permitted given the import purchasing power of the economy and the level of other resources and foreign exchange gap. Import purchasing power conferred by the value of exports plus capital transfers may be inadequate to support the level of growth permitted by the level of domestic saving. The two-gap theory purports that investment and development are restricted by the level of either domestic saving or import purchase capacity. Traditionally, the role of foreign borrowings has been advocated by countries as a supplement to domestic saving to bring an investment saving gap and achieve faster economic growth. The concept of dual gap analysis, however, pioneered by Chenry and his collaborators, shows that foreign borrowings may also be viewed as a supplement to foreign exchange if to achieve a faster rate of growth and development. The gap between foreign exchange earnings from exports and necessary imports is larger than the domestic investment saving gap. The domestic and foreign resources are not easily substitutable for one another. Foreign borrowing must fill the larger of the two gaps if the target growth is to be achieved. The historical sequence of experience originally suggested by Chenry was that countries in the pre-takeoff stage of development would have a dominant investment saving gap, followed by a dominant foreign exchange gap, with the possibility of a skill constraint at any stage. Most of the today's developing countries, apart from the oil producing and exporting countries, have a dominant foreign exchange gap which manifests itself in a chronic balance of payment deficit on the current account, while domestic resources lie idle. These deficits require financing not only in the interest of the countries themselves but for the sake of growth momentum of the world economy. There is interdependence in the world economic system since countries are interlinked through trade. If the historical experience of the developed countries is considered, in case where borrowing took place, the borrowing was converted into export surplus which enabled the countries to redeem its debt and become a net creditor. The condition for this to happen is that the marginal saving ratio should exceed the average in order to eliminate the investment saving gap. If that is the dominant constraint, or that the marginal propensity to export should exceed the marginal propensity to import, if foreign exchange is the dominant constraint. For most developing countries today, there is a little evidence that they have either the desire or the possibility to reduce the level of net resource inflows without a major disruption of their economies. The need for resources is as acute as ever because of a dominant foreign exchange gap to meet development requirements and to pay interest and amortization of past borrowing. The countries find it difficult to convert domestic resources into foreign exchange in adequate quantities, not only cyclically when the world economy is depressed, but also secularly owing to their economic structure, that is, they produce goods whose demand tends to be both price and income elastic in the world trade. After studying this module, you shall be able to explain the concept of dual gap, elaborate the cause of occurring of dual gap in the economy, understand the implications of dual gap for developing countries. Now we will discuss dual gap analysis and foreign borrowings. In national income accounting, an excess of investments over domestic savings is equivalent to a surplus of imports over exports. The national income equation can be written from the expenditure side as income is equal to consumption plus investment plus exports minus imports. Since saving is equal to income minus consumption, we have saving is equal to investment plus exports minus imports, or investment minus savings is equal to imports minus exports. A surplus of imports over exports financed by foreign borrowings allows a country to spend more than it produces or to invest more than it saves. Note that in accounting terms, the amount of foreign borrowings required to supplement domestic savings is the same whether the need is just for more resources for capital formation or for imports as well. The identity between the two gaps, the investment saving or IS gap and the import minus export or M minus X gaps, follows from the nature of the accounting procedures. It is a matter of arithmetic that if a country invests more than it saves, this will show up in the accounts as a balance of payments deficit. Or to put it another way, an excess of imports over exports necessarily implies an excess of the resources used by an economy over the resources supplied by it, or an excess of investment over savings. There is no reason in principle, however, why the two gaps should be equal ex ante, that is in a planned sense, that is that plans to invest in excess of planned saving should exactly equal plans to import in excess of plans to export. This is the starting point of dual gap analysis. Before going into dual gap analysis in more details, a reminder of elementary growth theory is in order. Growth requires investment goods which may either be provided domestically or be purchased from abroad. The domestic provision requires savings, the foreign provision requires foreign exchange. If it is assumed that some investment goods for growth can be provided only from abroad, a minimum amount of foreign exchange is always required to sustain growth process. In the Harrod model of growth, it will be remembered the relation between growth and savings is given by incremental capital output ratio, that is C, which is reciprocal of the productivity of capital, that is P, that is G is equal to S upon C or G is equal to SP, where G is the growth rate, S is the saving ratio. Likewise, the growth rate can be expressed as product of the incremental import ratio, that is delta Y upon M, which is denoted as M dash, and the ratio of investment good imports to income, that is M upon Y, which is equal to I, that is G is equal to I into M. If there is a lack of substitutability between domestic and foreign sources, growth will be constrained by whatever factors is the most limiting domestic saving or foreign exchange. Suppose, for example, that the growth rate permitted by domestic saving is less than the growth rate permitted by the availability of foreign exchange. In this case, growth will be saving limited, and if the constraint is not lifted, a proportion of foreign exchange will go unused. For example, suppose that product of the saving ratio, that is small s, and the productivity of capital, that is small p, give a permissible growth rate of 5%, and the product of import ratio, that is small I, and the productivity of imports, that is M dash, give a permissible growth rate of 6%. Growth is constrained to 5%, and for a given M dash, a proportion of foreign exchange available cannot be absorbed, at least for the purposes of growth. Some oil exporting countries fall into this category. Conversely, suppose that the growth rate permitted by the availability of foreign exchange, in this case the country will be foreign exchange constrained and the proportion of domestic saving will go unused. Most developing countries fall into this category. The policy implications are very clear. There will be resource waste as long as one resource constraint is dominant. If foreign exchange is the dominant constraint, ways must be found of using unused domestic resources to earn more foreign exchange and or raise the productivity of imports. If domestic saving is the dominant constraint, way must be found to using foreign exchange to augment domestic saving and or raise the productivity of domestic resources by relaxing a skill constraint. Suppose now a country sets a target rate of growth R. From our simple growth equations or the identities, the required saving ratio or S star to achieve the target is S star is equal to R upon P. And the required import ratio, that is I star, is equal to R upon M dash. If domestic saving is calculated to be less than the level required to achieve the target rates of growth, there is said to exist an investment saving gap equal to time t to IT minus ST is equal to S star gamma t minus S gamma t is equal to R upon P gamma t minus S into gamma t. Similarly, if minimum import requirements to achieve the growth rate are calculated to be greater than the maximum level of export earnings available for investment purposes, there is said to exist an import-export gap or foreign exchange gap equal to time t to mt minus xt is equal to I star gamma t minus I into gamma t is equal to R upon M dash multiplied by gamma t minus I into gamma t, where I is the ratio of imports to exports that is permitted by export earnings. If the target growth rate is to be achieved, foreign capital flows must fill the larger of the two gaps are not additive. If the import-export gap is larger than foreign borrowings, to fill it will also fill the investment savings gap. If the investment savings gap is the larger, foreign borrowings to fill it will obviously cover the smaller foreign exchange gap. The distinctive contribution of dual gap analysis to development theory is that if foreign exchange is the dominant constraint, it points to the dual role of foreign borrowings in supplementing not only deficient domestic savings but also foreign exchange. Dual gap theory thus performs the valuable service of emphasizing the role of imports and foreign exchange in the development process. It synthesizes traditional and more modern views concerning aid, trade and development. On the one hand, it embraces the traditional view of foreign assistance as merely a boost to domestic saving. On the other hand, it takes a more modern view that many of the goods necessary for growth cannot be produced by the developing countries themselves and must therefore be imported with the aid of foreign assistance. Indeed, if foreign exchange is truly the dominant constraint, it can be argued that dual gap analysis also presents a more relevant theory of trade for developing countries that justifies protection and import substitution. If growth is constrained by a lack of foreign exchange, free trade cannot guarantee simultaneous internal and external equilibrium, and the gains from trade may be offset by the underutilization of domestic resources. Let us now discuss the various assumptions of dual gap analysis. The basic underlying assumption of dual gap analysis is a lack of substitutability between foreign and domestic resources. This may seem a stringent assumption, but nonetheless may be valid, particularly in the short term. If foreign exchange is scarce, it is not easy in the short run to use domestic resources to earn more foreign exchange or to save foreign exchange by dispensing with imports. If it were easy, the question might well be posed, why do most developing countries suffer chronic balance of payment deficits over long period despite vast reserves of unemployed resources? If domestic saving is scarce, it is probably easier to find ways of using foreign exchange to substitute, raising the domestic saving ratio and the productivity of capital. The Arab oil producing countries are prime examples of countries with a surplus of foreign exchange and a dominant investment saving gap that use their foreign exchange to buy imported capital equipment and manpower. In most, if not all, the oil producing countries, there are a skill constraint that prevents full utilization of foreign resources available. The pioneering dual gap studies were undertaken by Chenry and his collaborators. If the countries studied, the typical sequence seemed to be an investment saving gap followed by an import-export gap in the take-off stage of development, sometimes of considerable stubbornness. In the past, before the oil price increases of 1993 and 1979, there was no tendency for one gap to predominate as a major constraint, taking the developing countries as a whole. Now, almost every non-oil producing developing country is confronted with a dominant foreign exchange gap. How temporary or permanent this dominant constraint must be a matter of conjecture depending on the future prices of oil, the future export performance of the developing countries and their ability to generate domestic saving. Next, we shall understand the critical appraisal. According to some eminent economists, two gap models face many pitfalls and is unable to solve the problems of developing countries. Its main shortcomings are undernoted. Number one, the lack of absorptive capacity. The dual gap approach does not consider the absorptive capacity of an economy and the ability to formulate and execute productive projects with aid. Only aggregative approach. A dual gap analysis is only an aggregative approach. It treats all types of capital investments as homogeneous. This is all unrealistic because LDC's capital requirement are for particular needs and they receive foreign aid for the different sectors. Only mechanistic. Dual gap approach is mechanistic. It assumes stable values of parameters in future, but this is absolutely unrealistic because capital output ratio and marginal saving rate change over time. Moreover, foreign aid cannot be exclusively relied upon to fill these gaps in the long run. Approximation of foreign aid requirements. The dual gap analysis is at best approximation for calculating the foreign aid requirements of LDCs. But there are difficulties in fixing import requirements and in arriving at postulated requirements. Thus, it provides a crude method of estimating the foreign aid requirements of LDCs. Benefits and cost of aid. It is possible to evaluate the quantity of all forms of resources transfer from developed countries to the developing countries by a common measure, the so-called grant equivalent or real resource cost. By this method, grants, loans of whatever term or condition, contributions in kind, technical assistance and foreign private investment can be valued at their net resource cost to donors or their net benefit to recipients. The method is based on reducing all loans to their grant equivalent by estimating the present value of future repayment streams to donors and to receipts. These values will ordinarily differ as between donors and recipients for the same loan because donors could have invested the sum they loaned at a rate of return that is different from the rate which the recipients could earn from investing the same sum domestically. If these alternative rates of return are known, the grant equivalent of the loan can be calculated by the methods described. A second element in determining real cost and benefits is to make allowance for excess cost of aid typing when they exist. These costs will also normally be different for donor and recipient, even when the same goods are being valued. In view of perspectives on aid flow, which the grant equivalent method offers, and the link which it provides between qualitative factors in the flow of resources from developed to developing countries, further application and refinement of the method would be desirable. Now moving on to the implications. The analysis of cost benefit gives birth to certain policy implications. Non-tied aid increases the real cost to the donor country, while the tied aid reduces the real cost to the donor. Moreover, tied aid increases the burden of repayment for the receipt and reduces the real benefit of aid. This analysis lays emphasis on developed countries to ease the terms of aid to the LDCs. They should so adjust the aid so that the grant equivalent per unit value of aid given should increase rather than decline. Further, there is always the fear that the recipient may default on loan payment. Therefore, the donor should provide grants rather than the loans. Now let us summarize what we have learnt in this module. Traditionally, the role of foreign borrowings has been advocated by countries as a supplement to domestic saving to bridge an investment saving gap and achieve faster economic growth. In national income accounting, an excess of investment over domestic savings is equivalent to a surplus of imports over exports. If growth is constrained by a lack of foreign exchange, free trade cannot guarantee simultaneous internal and external equilibrium, and the gains from trade may be offset by the underutilization of domestic resources. The basic underlying assumption of dual gap analysis is a lack of substitutability between foreign and domestic resources. This may seem a stringent assumption, but nonetheless may be valid, particularly in the short term. In view of the perspectives on aid flow which the grant equivalent method offers and of the link which it provides between qualitative factors in the flow of resources from developed to developing countries, further application and refinement of the method would be desirable.